The Sukhoi Su-27 flanker, interceptor, fighter bomber, and now also a long-range strike aircraft is a truly remarkable aeroplane. Born on the 20th of May 1977 during the Cold War with the Warsaw Pact, very little was known about it in the West until a decade later, when the Russian reconstruction, or perestroika, was instituted by Premier Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987. And with glasnost, or openness, the West was in for some shocks, particularly from Soviet military aircraft, which had been assumed to be inferior, especially the Su-27 with its NATO codename of Flanker. This is the remarkable story of a remarkable aircraft and the dedicated team of professionals who, under the supervision of their late founder Pavel Osipovich Sukhoi, created a masterpiece, the jewel in the Russian crown. After the First World War, Pavel Sukhoi found his fascination with aircraft overwhelming. He graduated from technical school in 1925 and went to work for Tupolev, where he learned his trade. As late as 1927, the Red Air Force felt that it was using too many foreign aircraft. New designs were needed. Tupolev and his chief designer, Pavel Sukhoi, came up with the ANT-5, a single-seater fighter powered by the 460 horsepower M22 engine, giving a top level speed of 160 miles an hour. In June 1937, the first successful polar flight was made by the specially built ANT-25. But that first trip was full of incident when the aircraft had mechanical problems but just managed to limp into Vancouver. The second attempt a month later, on July the 12th, was a different story when Gromov, Danilin and Yumashaev took off from a specially sloped runway and flew 6,306 miles from Moscow to San Jacinto in California. They'd been airborne for an amazing 2 days, 14 hours and 17 minutes. What's more, they had 3,300 pounds of fuel left in their tanks. They not only broke the world distance record at that time, but the Americans began to realize just how near Moscow was if you flew over the pole. Another long-distance record was set up by an all-female crew flying in the DB-2 Sukhoi long-range bomber. 1939 also saw the birth of the Design Bureau, and it also saw a military aircraft from Sukhoi. It was christened Su-2. It was a short-range bomber powered by the 1,100 horsepower M88 radial engine, and it was used in limited numbers from 1940. But Pavel Sukhoi was an innovator and an experimenter. During the war years, he produced a number of experimental fighters and small bombers. In the jet age, Sukhoi continued to concentrate on fighter bombers and fighters of every description. From December 1949, the Sukhoi OKB was closed by Stalin in retaliation for a failed jet prototype. Sukhoi and his team went back to Tupolev, where they worked on their own projects until Stalin's death on the 5th of March 1953. The first product of the new Sukhoi Bureau was the S-1 prototype of this Su-7, which was originally designed as an air-to-air fighter, but because of the more agile MiG-21, it was changed to a ground attacker. In the spring of 1956, the Su-7 flew at twice the speed of sound for the first time. Sukhoi had also been working on a delta-wing all-weather fighter, the Su-9. Given the code name Fishpot by NATO, the Su-9 was to become one of Sukhoi's great successes. During this time, his aircraft managed to break a number of speed and altitude records. Test pilot Vladimir Ilyushin broke the altitude record by climbing to a staggering 28,852 meters or 86,556 feet. He then got the absolute sustained height record of 21,170 meters or 64,526 feet. Boris Adrianov then broke the world distance record for a fighter by flying 2,092 kilometers, that's over 1,300 miles without refueling. He was followed by Anatoly Kaznyov, who broke the record again by achieving 2,337 kilometers, that's over 1,452 statute miles. Pavel Sukhoi was now seeing the fruits of his labors, as his aircraft were only second down the line from the mighty Mikoyan and its MiGs. The Su-7B became the standard tactical fighter bomber of the Soviet Air Force and was sold to many countries all over the world. The Su-15 Flagon twin-engine fighter interceptor was a development of the Su-9 and 11. The highly successful Su-7 had also been developed further with an uprated Lyulka turbojet and variable geometry wings. It became the Su-17 tactical fighter. At about this time, in 1969, Sukhoi and his team won a design contract for a long-range interceptor that would not only replace existing fighters of the IAPVO, the Soviet Union's air defense force, but also be able to beat the new American F-15 Eagle in air combat. At the time the requirement for the flanker was issued, the IAPVO was equipped with three main fighters: the single-seat Su-15 Flagon, the Yak-28 Brewer, and this enormous twin-seat Tupolev Tu-128, NATO codename Fiddler. This was the world's largest ever operational fighter. It was over 80 feet or 26 meters long. It had a range of around 3,000 miles and a top speed of 1,150 miles an hour. Armament was 4 Ash missiles, which came with both infrared and radar homing seekers. The Su-27 requirement also stipulated that the aircraft would have a limited role with Soviet frontal aviation, the tactical air arm. The Su-27 would be used as a fighter escort for long-range interdictors like the Su-24 Fencer. But at that time, frontal aviation's most numerous fighter and fighter bomber was the MiG-21 Fishbed, which first flew in 1955 and had been designed just after the Korean War. Meanwhile, manufacture of Sukhoi fighters and bombers continued apace. With SAM missiles and interceptors, a strike aircraft was needed to penetrate enemy defenses and fly under radar at very low levels. The Sukhoi OKB failed in their first attempt, but developed the Su-24 Fencer, which, like the American F-111, was a large two-seat swing-wing strike aircraft designed around the Soviet Union's first integrated avionics system, with a bomb sight, weapons control, and navigation systems coupled to two radars, one for attack and one for terrain following. If Sukhoi was to create a fighter better than the F-15, it was obvious that it had to be fly-by-wire to stabilize an unstable design. Unbeknown to the West, Sukhoi had already used a crude fly-by-wire system in his T-4 Mach 3 bomber. One of the problems with the T-4 was that the aircraft flexed a great deal in flight, so conventional hydromechanical controls simply wouldn't have worked. Back in 1967, well before America or the West, the Russians claimed to be the first in the world to have a fly-by-wire system to stabilize the aircraft. Sukhoi had already got 4 years fly-by-wire experience when the Bureau started on their new design, which was eventually to become the Su-27. Vladimir Ilyushin, the son of the famous Russian designer, was chief test pilot for this experimental project. He would also head the flying team for the 27. After the United States Air Force experiences in the Vietnam War, both the Russians and Americans looked at a ground attack aircraft to operate in the heart of battle, but be able to take immense punishment from ground fire and still get its pilot back to fight another day. Sukhoi were the first to protect the pilot with a titanium armored bathtub. The Americans soon used the same idea in the Fairchild A-10 tank buster, which was more agile but much slower than the Su-25 Frogfoot. The prototype Sturmovik, the T-8, was first flown by Vladimir Ilyushin on the 22nd of February 1975. While Frogfoot was being put through its paces, work was started on the Su-27. The design team was led by Yevgeny Ivanov, with Oleg Samolovich as his deputy. After 2 years of preliminary design work, it's said that the final layout of the aircraft was finalized by just 3 men over a single weekend. Pavel Sukhoi took a close interest in the project, which was to be his last. The hero of the Soviet Union died peacefully in 1975, unaware that his last innovation was to turn the aviation world on its ear and allow the Design Bureau, which still bears his name, to rise to the very summit of the Russian aerospace industry, eclipsing even the mighty MiG. The first prototype flanker, designated T-10-1, was wheeled out of the hangar for its maiden flight on the 20th of May 1977 at Tsukhovsky in the capable hands of its chief test pilot, Vladimir Ilyushin. The aircraft was a typical shape for that era, with twin-tail fins, widely spaced underslung engines, and an integrated wing-to-fuselage. To Western eyes, it was a copy of the F-15. Much later, they were to realize that this could not have been further from the truth. Those early test flights were to show up some serious design faults. It didn't have the range, and there were problems with stability which simply had to be cured. Even with modifications, the design meant that the aircraft was too heavy, had too much drag, and below expected engine thrust. It was clear that a major redesign was needed to get the fighter into shape, and the man given the task after Sukhoi's death in 1975 was Mikhail Petrovich Simonov, who was eventually destined to take overall charge of the Sukhoi Bureau. By today's standards, test facilities were fairly crude, but they had to work. Everything on every aircraft had to be tested to the limit, and that sometimes meant to destruction. For instance, how would a wing tank stand up to the sort of forces that you get at high Mach numbers where vibration could simply split it apart? And how would the mechanical side of the aircraft react to the pilot? How much actual force would he need to feel realism in a fly-by-wire system? How much would the canopy expand and contract at different temperatures, from very hot to freezing cold? Even the undercarriage had to go through rigorous testing in the lab to find out just how reliable it would be, or what improvements, if any, needed doing. Every dial and the electronics that ran them had to be checked and checked again, redesigned and improved if need be. The ejection system had to work. The hood blows first. The armaments all had to go through the same meticulous eye for detail, whether it be cannons or rockets. Another important test was to find out what would happen if one of the engines got hit from behind. How much damage would the aircraft sustain? Testing of the ejection seat was carried out using a rocket sled. This sequence shows trials of the Su-25 two-seat trainer, which uses the same K-36 ejection seat as the Su-27. The production Su-27 supersonic all-weather fighter interceptor was finally rolled out in 1984 with an impressive set of credentials. It had a top speed approaching 2,500 kilometers an hour, that's over 1,500 miles an hour. But it was also highly maneuverable at very slow speeds, as this rare Russian film shows. It could climb up to 19,000 meters, that's over 2 miles high. It had a range of 4,000 kilometers, or over 2,000 miles, and it could stay in the air for about 5 hours, with a maximum weapons load of 8 tons. Between 1986 and 1989, a highly modified version, the P-42, challenged the American F-15 specially stripped Streak Eagle for a number of world records. The P-42 was so clean that with its uprated engines, it had to be tethered to a military vehicle using twin cables and an electronic lock release, as the standard brakes simply couldn't hold it back. The P-42 set a total of no less than 27 new world records. Its rate of climb was 213 meters, or 700 feet per second. The Su-27 had an integral airframe with the wings and fuselage blended together to give it more lift and less drag. With its relatively fuel-efficient Saturn Lyulka turbofans, its aerodynamic airframe and room for more internal fuel, the flanker had exceptional endurance for an aircraft of its type. It had 2 powerful horizontal stabilizers, flaperons, drooped leading edges, and a fly-by-wire system to improve both its performance and maneuverability. The Su-27 was designed to be unstable and run by its computers, but the fly-by-wire system was so efficient that it meant that the pilot controlled the aircraft in exactly the same way as a stable one. The same system controlled the so-called high-lift devices, raising the aircraft's all-important lift-to-drag ratio during a combat maneuver, again being greater at a greater angle of attack. It also made sure that the pilot couldn't overstress the aircraft, whatever he did. This not only protected it from too high angles of attack, but meant that the pilot didn't have to worry about it, which gave him a psychological edge in a war situation. And it also meant that he couldn't get into an unwanted spin or overload the computer system. The fly-by-wire control system had 4 extra channels so that if any of its components failed, another channel would automatically take over, leaving the pilot free to get on with the job in hand. Victor Churkin was a combat pilot, so what did he think of the flanker?
The Sukhoi Su-27 is very maneuverable, and its minimal radius of turn is quite comparable with that of piston-engine fighters of the World War II. The fighter's good cockpit visibility and small deflections of its control surfaces make possible to pilot it confidently at small altitudes. I always pilot the fighter with pleasure. I find it hard to believe that an aircraft whose weight exceeds 20 tons is so controllable.
Because the Su-27 was designed to land on rough terrain, its engines are protected from any stones or rubble by these simple anti-ingestion protective screens, which work totally automatically during the taxiing, takeoff and landing phases. Its twin engines are set well apart with an integral fire protection system between them. The wide clearances between the fuel tanks and intake ducts stop the risk of any fire spreading. The early versions of the aircraft had their fuel tanks filled with polyurethane foam. This is a dramatic example of a fuel tank filled with foam and shot at by a round of ammunition. The same again, a round of ammunition fired at an unprotected fuel tank. All these protective measures meant that the flanker should survive if it was hit in combat. The engines were designed to be easy to maintain, with jobs like changing the first stage blades of both a compressor and a turbine right on the airfield, without having to send the whole engine to the repair plant. Two search and track systems were coupled to a look-down pulse Doppler radar, an infrared target finder with a laser rangefinder, and a helmet-mounted sight system, which allows the pilot to aim his weapons at the target without turning the aircraft. A navigation system and an automatic flight control system means that the aircraft can take off in bad weather, day or night, with a 200-foot cloud base and 2,500-foot visibility. There are 10 hardpoints under the aircraft for weapons or stores. Early versions carried 4 Archer air-to-air and 6 Alamo missiles. Apart from the underwing stores, Flanker has an internal 30mm cannon with a potent 200 rounds of ammunition. The cannon is linked to the target designator with a rangefinder which is said to help in close combat. With its variety of missiles, the Flanker can fight from a distance or at close quarters. One of its requirements was to escort the Su-24 Fencer bombers to their targets. While the squadrons took off, the Aleutian A-50 AWACS got itself into position to control the battle. The flankers led the bombers towards the target area, guided by the AWACS, and literally blasted away through any enemy attack using their range of missiles. Until the way was clear for the bombers to drop their load. Even by 1987, the West hadn't had a good look at the Su-27. But one of its first encounters turned out to be too close for comfort. A Norwegian P-3 Orion patrol plane met two flankers. One of the flankers got too close and hit one of the Orion's props, damaging both aircraft with bits of the prop flying through the Orion's fuselage. Now the West had seen Russia's mystery aircraft, its aviation industries were suddenly spurred into action. 1989, the Paris Air Show was the first time that the Western crowds were to witness for themselves how true the rumors had been about the Su-27. Was it as agile and potent as they'd been led to believe? Test pilot Viktor Pugachev left them in no doubt at all with his dazzling display. He pulled his 22-ton aircraft straight off the runway into a vertical figure of 8 within an 800-meter frame. Pugachev stunned the crowd with a maneuver never seen in the West before. Pugachev's Cobra, a move that he'd invented himself and that was to become an international trademark for the Sukhoi. The aircraft flew straight and level, then pitched its nose up to 120 degrees. Pugachev then pushed the stick forward and into level flight again. No other fighter anywhere could do the Cobra. It seemed that the rumors were true after all. This was indeed a truly remarkable aeroplane. Its chief test pilot, Vladimir Ilyushin, was in no doubt at all.
Before flying this aircraft, I piloted vehicles of 142 different types, and always came to know that I was, so to say, more intelligent than a flying machine, and more capable than it was. In the case with the Sukhoi Su-27, it was the other way around. It appeared to be more intelligent than me. The aircraft is more capable than a pilot. So, in order to use its great potential, a pilot's self-perfection is essential. Moreover, when I piloted the Su-27 for the first time, I understood this was the aircraft you could wait all of your life. It's worth being a pilot of this fighter. On account of a delight I felt in the air, a smile doesn't vanish from my face till now. I'm sure that everyone who will pilot the fighter will feel the same way.
The Russian Navy had planned to build 4 new aircraft carriers to take them into the 21st century. In fact, only one was completed, but even that needed new aircraft. Sukhoi began by altering its basic Su-27 design by fitting canard foreplanes, an arrestor hook, a beefed-up undercarriage, a refueling probe, and twin nose wheels. Land trials were started at Saki in the Crimea on a dummy landing deck with arrestor wires and a ski ramp for takeoff. It's understood that during these trials, at least one Su-27K was in fact lost. Other changes to the basic 27 were that the distinctive tail cone section was shortened to miss the deck on landing and rotating. There was also the plumbing available to carry an external fuel tank. trials went on day and night until it was felt safe for Viktor Pugachev to find the aircraft carrier Tbilisi and to land on it for the first time. He refueled in the air and tracked in towards the carrier. Then lined up for his final approach. First time around was a touch and go just to get the feel of the pounding ship. Then a second attempt. Third time lucky. Yes, on the third attempt, he brought the flanker in for a perfect deck landing. Where Mikhail Simonov and the engineers and crew were waiting to give him a hero's welcome. Pugachev's historic landing was made on November the 1st, 1989. His takeoff run proved that the Su-27K could get into the air after a ski run of 100 meters, or 328 feet, with no catapult. It was soon the turn of his heir apparent, the young Yevgeny Frolov, to bring his aircraft in for a perfect landing on the Tbilisi. He got the customary welcome from the waiting crew. Later, the carrier changed its name to the Kuznetsov, and the aircraft uprated to the Su-33. The great rival for the naval contract came from Sukhoi's arch competitor in the form of the MiG-29 KVP. It too had wings that folded for stowage. To get full power before takeoff, the Russians used this very simple chocking system built into the deck. Once the aircraft is at full power, the retaining chocks simply disappear. Although the MiG was an equally fine aircraft, which had been well proven over the years, it was Sukhoi who won the contract to supply its 33s to the Russian Navy. However brilliant an aircraft seems, accidents and failures will happen, as this MiG-29 pilot found out. In the early stages of the flanker's development, the second prototype was lost in a fatal crash. A wing fault killed another pilot and nearly destroyed a second T-10. Fortunately, these two men lived to fly another sortie. To the uninitiated, both the MiG-29 and the Su-27 look very similar, but there are distinct differences. The Sukhoi is a much larger aircraft when you compare them closely. The MiG has a shorter nose and is not as drooped as the Sukhoi. Looking from above and behind, the Sukhoi has a much wider fuselage. The MiG cockpit seems smaller and slightly more cramped than its bigger brother, where there's not only more space, but the Sukhoi seems a lot more complex, and it looks a little more modern. But both look positively ancient, compared to the American F-15 layout with its state-of-the-art screens instead of old-fashioned dials. In fact, the whole Sukhoi program was developed because the F-15 Eagle was far away and ahead of anything the Russians had in the early 70s. Even in the F-15As, which went into service in 1976, the pilot sat high with an excellent all-round view, surrounded by analog instruments, with his head-up display on the windshield in front of him. The first F-15s to engage in combat were blooded by Israel on the 27th of June 1979, when they claimed 5 MiG-21s of the Syrian Air Force. The F-15E is a strike attack aircraft with a top speed of 1,650 miles an hour and a ferry range of 3,570 miles. Farnborough 1990 was the first time we'd seen the two-seater version of the Su-27, the Su-27UB. To all intents and purposes, the two-seater version could do everything that the single-seater could do in the capable hands of our old friend Yevgeny Frolov. At takeoff, it has a thrust-to-weight ratio of better than 1:1. That's an awful lot of poke. Frolov threw 22 tons of aircraft around the sky as if it were a small aerobatics plane, with lightning-quick spins and a huge cobra of over 120 degrees. Some argue that this maneuver is merely an airshow stunt. Others argue that in combat the aircraft can be slowed down so quickly that any hostile missile would find it very difficult to hit its target, and an enemy fighter on its tail may well overshoot the Su, just as the Harrier proved with its spectacular Viving maneuver. As Yevgeny got out of the Su-27UB, he was to come face to face with Captain Mal McNair, who had just demonstrated his CF-18 Hornet. The two former enemies were soon into pilot's talk and couldn't wait to have a guided tour around each other's aircraft. Mal was relieved to see that the Su cockpit was relatively old-fashioned, but the Russian policy at the time was to standardize all fighter cockpits so that any Russian pilot could transfer from one type to another with as little interruption as possible. The Hornet, on the other hand, was equipped with the very latest glass cockpit, with most of the pilot's information transmitted on computer screens. So how did the Sukhoi compare with Western fighters? Mal McNair.
I think it compares pretty favorably with Western fighters as far as airshow performances. As far as what it would do as a weapons platform, that hasn't been proven yet, and hopefully won't be proven in the future. But in my personal opinion, not the opinion of my government, I think the Western fighters still hold an edge in the avionics and the weapons systems we have on board.
So how do you do the Cobra? Well, come in level at 220 knots with 85% power, pull back with about 35 pounds of pressure on the stick to override the angle of attack limiter. The aircraft rears up with its underside becoming a huge air brake. Push the stick forward and ease in some power to return straight and level. If you make a mess of it, press the small white button on the top right of the control column, which engages a system that will automatically correct the aircraft, whatever its attitude. The Su-35 was designed as a follow-on from the basic Su-27 with much better dogfighting capabilities, and was the first derivation aircraft to have an unstable integral triplane or three-wing aerodynamic configuration. It has a new glass cockpit with a vastly uprated and completely new digital fly-by-wire control system, which is quadruplex, using 4 channels in pitch and 3 in yaw. It has a totally new radar, allowing 15 targets to be tracked at a time, with 6 that can be engaged at a range of 225 miles. It also has a redesigned tail cone with a reshaped tip housing a dielectric radome rather than the usual brake chute cover, giving it over-the-shoulder radar coverage. The aircraft is capable of automatic terrain following and avoidance, and it can attack ground targets without even entering the battle area. Apart from new uprated engines, the Su-35 has new tail fins, taller than the 27UB, and each one houses an auxiliary fuel tank. Finally, the Su-35 can carry a very long-range anti-AWACS missile to knock out the enemy's combat control system. Yet another derivation of the basic Su-27 is this 27IB Platypus fighter bomber. Anatoly Ivanov climbs up the nose-wheel ladder into the spacious cockpit. The cockpit itself is surrounded by titanium armor some 17 millimeters thick. It's thought that the original concept for the aircraft was as a naval trainer with its side-by-side seating. An altitude pressure of 7,000 feet is maintained in the cockpit up to 30,000 feet, which means the crew don't have to work with their oxygen masks on. The Platypus is equipped with air-to-air refueling, which gives it a very long range, and the crew can even lean back on one of the seats and take a nap on a long endurance flight. The Su-32FN, confusing, isn't it? The Su-32FN is an updated version of the 27IB, with a beefed-up main gear having 2 wheels per side and a double nose wheel. When it arrived at the Paris Air Show in 1995, it had flown non-stop from Moscow with no in-flight refueling at all. Every country has its display teams. The British with the red arrows, the French with their Patrie de France. The Russians are no exception. One of their teams is the Russian Knights. Their leader flies the Su-27UB conversion trainer. The rest of the team fly a mixture of single-seaters and two-seaters. Their show is not as flamboyant as the Reds, but it doesn't need to be, as it's still unique. The pilots are chosen from the 234th Prokhorovsky Guards Fighter Regiment at Kubinka. The Sukhoi Su-27 Aerobatics Demonstration Team, the Russian Knights. The modern Sukhois can carry a variety of weapons, but the basics are still the R-27 Alamo and R-73 Archer. The Archers are the smaller of the two, and they're usually found on the outboard rails. They have thrust vectoring vanes, which make the missiles very agile at short range of up to, well, a couple of miles. The R-27 Alamos are generally stored on the inboard rails. This is one of the weapons the former Soviet Union is alleged to have stolen from the West. Well, it does have a resemblance to the Sparrow missile. Both missiles are long range. They're both missiles that are launched once the target has been spotted on the aircraft's radar. They also have a small radar of their own for guidance and detonation on the target. Maximum range, it's about 35 miles. Apart from the Alamo and the Archer, the Sukhois use the long-range AAML and very long-range anti-AWACS weapon. The naval Sukhois, the 27K and the Su-33s, carry a centerline KH-41 Mosquito anti-shipping missile and a clutch of long-range weapons, but all missiles are constantly being updated. As Sukhoi progress by bettering a basically superb machine, what are they up against in the 21st century? Dassault has invested heavily in Rafale. On June the 8th, 1995, the Dassault 1 single-seater shot down a Mica missile guided by a new radar developed by Dassault. Rafale comes in different sizes, with a two-seater, a single-seater, a naval version, and it should replace half a dozen strike interceptor and reconnaissance types in the French Air Force. Lockheed Boeing won a contract to produce the replacement for the F-15 Eagle, the F-22. It'll cruise long range at supersonic speeds without afterburners. And it uses stealth technology to beat advanced radar defense systems. The contract was won after a contest with McDonnell Douglas. Its problem is, of course, its massive cost. Another aircraft in competition with Sukhoi will be Eurofighter, which progresses as we head towards the millennium. It's a joint venture between Germany, Britain, Italy, and Spain, with each country contributing in the development. In September 1996, DA-2, or Development Aircraft 2, in the capable hands of test pilot John Turner, gave a well-paced performance at Farnborough 96. He was limited in power with two Tornado engines instead of the planned Eurojet 200 engines. But Farnborough was about to witness one of the greatest air displays in its 50-year history, from a Sukhoi, the new Su-37. No other jet fighter in the world can do a 360-degree loop virtually in its own length. The Su-37 can, but how's it done? Well, it's partly down to the vectored thrust. Instead of having jet thrusts pointing directly backwards, the pilot can move the nozzles up or down to give the aircraft extra maneuverability. Test pilot Yevgeny Frolov thinks that the new fly-by-wire system and the new nozzles make a big difference.
Yes, big difference because absolutely new control, absolutely new flight-by-wire. Of course, nozzle control system is new too.
With the new nozzles, Frolov can do a Super Cobra, which he can stop at any time and roll out of.
Super Cobra, it's Cobra together with control. In all position I can stop this Cobra. I can make Cobra through 360 degrees.
But does the nozzle control have a separate lever?
Okay, we have a button on the stick. If I not push this button, control is normal. Or if I push this button, I can cross limited angle of attack and G. When I making 360 degrees Cobra, I pushing this button and pull stick.
So can we expect to see this new nozzle technology on any of the other Sukhois in service?
Yes, of course. It's first prototype of plane with nozzle control. Of course, if when we will have good potential of this system, we use on all plane Sukhoi. It's a serial engine and only new nozzle control. This same engine we can set all Sukhoi plane on Sukhoi 27 too.
And perhaps on Eurofighter?
Yes, of course, why not?
John Turner, test pilot for Eurofighter, doesn't think he needs vectored thrust.
Vectored thrust and a large canard that's placed well forward of the main plane, as this aircraft have, are two ways of solving the same problem, and that's getting maneuverability at supersonic speed. If you have a large canard, and you'll notice that none of the other aircraft here have a canard of the same size, nor indeed of the same moment arm, I move sufficiently far forward from the main plane as we do. If you have that large canard with a large moment arm, you don't actually need to use the nozzles.
During Farnborough Week 1996, the Russians threw down a challenge. Mikhail Semenov said that here at Farnborough we can take on any American pilot and we'd be happy to perform an actual dogfight.
Well, certainly under the right circumstances, you'd like to have that challenge to go up against. It would be an interesting fight.
Needless to say, the challenge didn't take place, and John Turner was not too impressed with the Cobra as a combat maneuver.
Big problem that I have, and most of the combat pilots that I've spoken to feel the same way, is that they're wonderful effects for an air show, but they don't do much for you in combat.
People used to say the same thing about the Harrier, though, didn't they? Wonderful airshow aeroplane, they said, but not much good when you get it out in the real world.
That's true as well. And if you look at the Harrier VIF maneuver, which was, when it was first introduced, thought to be absolutely
wonderful. That was the vectoring in forward flight.
That's right, yeah. Where he uses his nozzles just to slow his aircraft down and make it go stationary effectively in the air. Well, I've flown in a Phantom against someone doing that. That was horrifying the first time you saw it. The second time, you just shot him out of the sky because you knew where he was going to be for the next 2 minutes. So it actually makes the combat pilot predictable. And the one thing you don't want to do in a modern combat is to let the enemy know what it is you're going to do next. The Cobra maneuver actually is not a problem for the weapon system that we carry in this aircraft. And indeed, it's not a problem for most weapon systems nowadays.
But surely things never stand still for long in modern aviation. Time for a last look at the breathtaking performance of the Su-37. No one can doubt that Pavel Sukhoi's legacy has been a world shaker. His influence will be with us for generations to come.
At 1500 hours, on Tuesday, the 30th of August, 1988, history was made. For the first time since Defense Minister Molotov landed in Britain in a Tupolev SB-2 in 1941, Soviet combat aircraft were about to touch down on British soil. However, far from being an act of aggression, this was an extraordinary example of Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost in action, but in the most dramatic way. As well as establishing a new Soviet desire to market its defense products more widely. What made the visit all the more incredible was the fact that the aircraft that landed on that cloudy afternoon were far removed from the somewhat crude designs that the West had come to know from Korea and Vietnam. The MiG-29 single-seater and the MiG-29UB combat trainer, given the name Fulcrum by NATO, amazed the crowds at the Farnborough Air Show with their stunning tail slides and knife-edge passes. For the first time, Western analysts had a long overdue chance to evaluate the performance of the Soviets' latest fighter aircraft. There was a widespread belief that the best that Soviet engineers could do was to plagiarize Western designs. They were unnerved to discover that far from lagging behind the West in both technology and design philosophy, the Mikoyan Design Bureau in Moscow had come up with a formidable aircraft that could possibly be considered the best air combat and multi-role fighter in the world. At least as maneuverable as the American F-16, and better at high angles of attack, it can fly at Mach 2.2, but land on shorter, rougher airstrips than any Western equivalent. But for Glasnost, this would have been a terrifying thought. Even so, the fact that in the past, MiG jets have flown with around 40 air forces throughout the world, including North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, Egypt, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, India, Iraq, and former Yugoslavia, gives cause for concern and makes it understandable why Allied forces were so keen to keep enemy aircraft firmly on the ground during the Gulf War and more recently in Bosnia. The MiG-29 has once again brought to the forefront a name which has always been synonymous in Western minds with the ferocious evil of the Communist Empire. Ever since Korea in the 1950s, when the performance of the MiG-15 came as a surprise to American pilots, the designs of the Mikoyan Design Bureau have been taken very seriously. But the story of their development goes back to before the Second World War. Stalin saw the need to develop an effective combat aircraft industry in preparation for what he knew would be a threat from the Nazi government in Berlin. Experience in the Spanish Civil War had shown that the Soviet-built E-15 and E-16 were no match for Franco's German Messerschmitts in terms of speed and altitude. If Russia was to be effectively defended through the next decade, something better was needed. In February of 1939, Stalin, through Molotov, his defense minister, brought together the best Soviet design talent, among them Yakovlev, Tupolev, Lavochkin, and two designers who would team up to form the Mikoyan Design Bureau, Artem I. Mikoyan and Mikhail Gurievich. As a direct response to the problem in hand, their bureau took on the motto, speed and altitude. By 1940, the MiG team had come up with its first design concepts, the I-61 and I-65. They both featured a water-cooled piston engine and a small, aerodynamically shaped frontal area, which produced less drag and higher speed in flight. The prototype was transferred to the assembly lines in February of 1940 and became the first Mikoyan Gurievich plane to be put into production. Designated the MiG-1, it featured a Mikulin AM-35 piston engine. Arkady Ikatov, the first ever MiG test pilot, flew the plane to a new Soviet speed record of 527 miles per hour, making it the fastest interceptor of the period, faster even than the Supermarine Spitfire. The design brief for an aircraft that could intercept and repel German bombers at high altitude, as well as adequately engage fighters nearer the ground, had been achieved. However, the MiG-1 proved to be susceptible to battle damage, and only 100 were built, before it was superseded by the strengthened and aerodynamically refined MiG-3. The use of new phenol-impregnated woods made the MiG-3 a very sturdy machine, which excelled at high altitude and could sustain quite heavy machine gun fire. Its survivability was demonstrated by Junior Lieutenant Lukyanov when he returned his MiG-3 safely to its base after ramming a Junkers 88, cutting off its tail. The modular design enabled quick, easy and cheap construction, and by mid-1941 the factories were turning out 25 to 28 aircraft every day. However, on the 22nd of June 1941, a German attack took the Soviets by surprise. 70% of its air force were concentrated on 60 airfields, well within the range of the Luftwaffe. They were neither dispersed or concealed and had no radar warning. German reports claimed that 1,200 aircraft had been destroyed by lunchtime and a further 600 by nightfall of the first day. Almost 4,000 planes had been destroyed by the middle of that week, many of them brand new MiGs, Yaks and Lags. On the 27th of June, the decision was taken to form 6 new air defense regiments equipped with MiG-3s. The planes soon proved themselves in an air defense role, especially against high-flying bombers. Along with new aircraft from the Yakovlev and Lavochkin design bureaus, the MiGs played a major role in the defense of Moscow, often flying from rough, unmade and perilously short runways, and being equipped with bombs mounted on the wings to attack tanks and motorized troops. They excelled at high altitude, knocking 900 Nazi bombers out of the Moscow skies in the first 6 months of the war, but generally came unstuck when faced with the better flown and better armed Messerschmitts in dogfights at lower level. Development continued throughout the war, and new, more powerful engines were put to use in these I-220 and I-224 prototypes, the latter gaining the record for the greatest altitude for a fighter at that time. This I-222 prototype featured the first pressurized cockpit, making even higher altitudes a possibility. But the aim now was for speed, and it was quickly realized that the piston engine and propeller combination had already reached its speed limit of about 500 miles per hour. A new form of propulsion had to be found. Mikoyan had been working on axial flow turbojets as early as 1938, but development had been halted at the start of the war in favor of projects that would produce quick results. Now, these efforts were renewed. A first step towards a fully jet-propelled aircraft was the I-250 prototype, featuring a piston engine that powered both a conventional propeller and a compressor that fed air to a combustion chamber and nozzle in the tail. A small batch of these planes saw service in naval aviation as the MiG-13. Another early development was the Utka, or Duck, a 3-seater experimental aircraft which, despite its ungainly looks, was a precursor for later swept-wing design. The wing took its shape from that of an arrowhead. It had a tricycle arrangement undercarriage and an M11 engine in a pusher configuration. It had an unusual canard wing as a forward stabilizer, with vertical stabilizers mounted on the wings. Test flights by A.N. Grinchik proved the major advantage of this aerodynamic configuration: safe flight at high angles of attack. None of these concepts saw any serious use during the war. Unlike the British and Germans, the Soviets were unable to produce a true jet aircraft before the end of hostilities. With the war now over, the Soviets had no time to rest on their laurels. Defense of their now enlarged country was a priority, and the lessons learned over Moscow and on the Eastern Front proved that air superiority was the name of the game. The rest of the world was moving quickly into the jet age, and the Soviets needed to compete on equal terms. With the help of an influx of German and Austrian engineers, and borrowing heavily from German designs, the bureaus worked towards a fully jet-powered fighter. Mikoyan's first prototype had its maiden flight on the 24th of April, 1946. An impressive straight-wing design, it had a divided nose air intake feeding two German BMW turbojets. It went into production as the MiG-9, and thus became the first Soviet jet fighter to fly. It was armed with a 37 and two 23mm Nudelmann cannon. It had a top speed of 565 miles per hour and a ceiling of 42,000 feet, and featured the pressurized cockpit seen in the I-222 prototype, as well as air brakes, a tricycle nose-wheel undercarriage, and an ejector seat. In fact, it was the first Soviet jet to be abandoned in mid-air. But it was certainly not the last. The effectiveness of this ejector seat was demonstrated using dummies in a MiG-21. This pilot was brave enough to demonstrate it for real. And it proved its worth in this accident, involving a Yak Forger vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. Even the MiG-29 is not immune from accidents. The life of Anatoly Kvorchul was saved by his ejector seat at Le Bourget in 1989. After this first rush into the jet age, there was a need for more sophisticated designs and more powerful engines. These could be designed in Russia given time, but they were needed now and already existed in Britain and America. Stalin was reported to have asked, "Who would be so stupid as to let us have their engines?" Britain's Labour government duly provided 40 Rolls-Royce Derwents and 25 Neens in late 1946. In March of 1946, the bureaus were given the task of producing a high-altitude, clear-weather interceptor to replace the MiG-9. They were to use the new British engines, which were twice as powerful as the ex-German units. In contrast to its competitors, the MiG Bureau came up with a design that was quite revolutionary. This I-270 experimental interceptor first flew in late '46. It used a two-chamber liquid rocket motor, producing 3,400 pounds of thrust. This power, which remained constant at altitude, enabled high speeds, high rate of climb, and a high ceiling, features which were to remain with all later MiG designs. For the first time, it used a slender swept wing with a stable roll profile and a T-shaped tail. These early prototypes were such an advance on anything that the Soviets or the Germans had produced before, that Mikoyan and Gurevich received the Stalin Prize for 1947, worth 150,000 rubles to each. In the spring of 1948, it was ordered into production as the MiG-15. It had a 45-degree swept wing, a maximum speed of 652 miles per hour, and a service ceiling of 50,000 feet. It retained the MiG-9's 37 and two 23mm cannon. It was simple and strong. It could fly from unmade and grass airfields and had a short takeoff run. It was of modular design and could be easily assembled and maintained. A four-man crew could replace an engine in an hour and a wing in 25 minutes. Some 18,000 were produced and eventually served with almost 30 air forces throughout the world. In 1950, it was brought in to replace the aging piston-engine aircraft that had made up the North Korean Air Force. Its performance came as a great surprise to American pilots flying straight-winged F-80 Shooting Stars and aging Mustangs. It was faster, higher, more maneuverable, and with greater firepower. America quickly retaliated by introducing the new F-86 Sabre. This was America's second-generation jet fighter and could compete on more even terms. Even so, the MiG could climb twice as fast and to a greater height, and could survive a heavy onslaught from the Sabre's 6 machine guns. The lessons learnt in Korea were incorporated into the I-330 prototype. It first flew on the 13th of January 1950 and went into production as the MiG-17 in 1952, too late to play a part in Korea. It was larger than the MiG-15, but with its new afterburning engine and 45-degree swept wings, it could fly faster at 711 miles per hour and higher at 54,500 feet. In the hands of test pilot Ivachenko, it even managed to break the sound barrier during a dive. It was the Soviets' first transonic fighter. The MiG-15 had always had a dangerous tendency to snap roll into an uncontrollable spin during a high-speed turn. Many of the changes incorporated in the MiG-17 were designed to overcome these problems of handling and stability at high speeds. Czech-built MiG-17s saw action in the defense of Egypt during the Suez Crisis and were used extensively in both the Yom Kippur and 6 Days War over Israel. Although the superior tactics and better trained pilots of the Israeli Defense Force resulted in the majority of Arab MiGs being destroyed even before they left the ground. Later, the 17 was to play a major role in defending North Vietnamese targets against American bombers. In late 1950, an order was issued for the design of a day fighter that could achieve supersonic speed in level flight. Most research was done in conjunction with the Sagi Flight Research Institute and the Zhukovsky Aerohydrodynamic Institute. New aerodynamic wing shapes were tested using a flying laboratory, and the characteristics of straight, swing, and delta wing designs investigated. The result was the twin-engined I-320 prototype. Its two-man crew was seated side by side, and its engines were mounted in tandem. Later prototypes incorporated a Tumansky turbojet with a Lushkin liquid propellant rocket engine that could be switched on at takeoff, enabling a much reduced takeoff run. In flight, it could boost speed and altitude. Early flights by test pilot Vashin proved the design could reach the sound barrier. Grigory Sedov was chief test pilot during this exciting period.
In May 1952, we started to explore supersonic flight with a prototype for the MiG-19, the SN-2. But the thrust was not great enough, So first we tried to reach the speed of sound during a dive. In January 1954, after installing more powerful engines with afterburners, we found that we could overcome the sound barrier in horizontal flight. This prototype was called the SN9. It was a very important step for us. The MiG-19 was the first supersonic military fighter aircraft. But for us, it was not just a fighter, it was the way forward to designing further supersonic planes. The designers had many new ideas that were translated onto this plane, without which we would never have reached supersonic speed.
By 1953, the prototypes first flown by Grigory Sedov and later by Konstantin Kokinaki had gone into production as the MiG-19. This aircraft featured two of the Tumansky RD-9B turbojets, each developing a thrust of 7,300 pounds. It had nose-mounted axial compressors and afterburn chambers, which ensured high power-to-weight ratios. Attaining a speed of 900 miles per hour, with its highly swept 58-degree wing, it was not only the Soviets, but the world's first mass-produced supersonic fighter. Various innovations came about during development, including rocket-assisted zero-length takeoff, which could project a MiG-19 to 80 feet and a speed of 150 miles per hour in 3 seconds. Mid-air refueling from Tupolev Tu-4 flying tankers was also developed, using wing-mounted nozzles on the MiG-19 and a nose-mounted cone system on the MiG-15. This considerably increased the range of these aircraft, which were not noted for their fuel efficiency. In the mid-50s, the threat of intercontinental nuclear bombers was seen as so great as to warrant an order for a brand new supersonic high-altitude interceptor. The Mikoyan Bureau departed from the popular swept wing and plumped for a delta design that afforded greater speed and maneuverability, but with a reduction in weight. This new wing overcame the stability and handling problems that had plagued the earlier aircraft. The prototype first flew on the 16th of June, 1956, and was flown by Colonel Likachov in an air display in Moscow a week later.
Которую он сейчас ведет, в 2 раза превышает скорость звука. Потолок более 20 тысяч метров. Еще сложнее выполнять на сверхзвуковых машинах. Потолок более 20 тысяч...
By 1958, test pilot Georgy Masolov had set a new altitude record of 111,500 feet. And Konstantin Kokinaki achieved a world speed record of 1,335 miles per hour, almost 500 miles per hour faster than the MiG-19. Later, Masolov trumped even this with a speed of 1,484 miles per hour. The resulting Mach 2 interceptor, produced from 1960, was designated the MiG-21 and became the most successful and widely used Soviet fighter to date. In numerous variations, it has been delivered to 30 countries worldwide and has set 17 world records. It entered production as a day fighter, powered by an afterburning Tumansky R-11 turbojet, with a system of solid fuel accelerators to reduce takeoff distance and an automatic system of air intake ramps for supersonic flight. It was armed with the Soviets' latest air-to-air missiles and a 30mm cannon. Its greater power and lighter weight gave impetus to the program that was expanding the range of Soviet armaments. Although introduced quite late to the Vietnam conflict, it was used very effectively to down B-52 strategic bombers, the purpose for which it had been originally designed. However, the US Air Force had not stood still either, and its F-4 Phantom was a formidable adversary, once again flown by well-trained pilots. Most Chinese and Vietnamese pilots were trained by the Russians, both practically and psychologically. Nguyen Swat was an NVA pilot during the conflict.
I have been flying this plane for 13 years now. For 6 months, between April and October of 1972, I hit 6 American planes. 4 were F-4 Phantoms. By comparison with the Phantom, this plane is superior in terms of its flying characteristics. I testify to it being very good.
A favorite tactic of the North Vietnamese pilots was to use the by now comparatively slow and underarmed MiG-17 as bait to lure the American Phantoms. On engaging the MiG-17s, the Phantoms would suddenly find themselves descended upon by ground-controlled supersonic MiG-21s that would attack and then disappear before any retaliation could be mounted. However, many still found themselves within the sights of a Phantom. The MiG-21 has remained the enduring image of the Cold War skies. The English journal Flying Review calling it the symbol of Russian military power. It was also Artem I. Mikoyan's last design. Even before the MiG-21 went into production, there were plans for an even faster, more powerful interceptor. The design called for an aircraft that would fulfill a multitude of roles. Its operational range needed to be extended. It had to be able to carry greater and heavier warloads. It needed to use larger, more powerful radar that could detect targets at a greater range, all of which meant more powerful but heavier engines. This would mean higher takeoff and landing speeds and longer airstrips. However, the need was still for an aircraft that could operate from the shortest possible unmade airstrips and at the same time achieve supersonic flight. The answer had to be a radical one. The prototype, which saw its first flight tests during the winter of 1966, utilized the then fashionable variable geometry wings. The resulting production aircraft was designated the MiG-23. In contrast to its predecessor, this was a lightweight multi-purpose aircraft. With the wings at a 16-degree angle, it could land and take off from very short, unimproved airfields. In the moderately swept 45-degree angle, it had maximum maneuverability and could engage in dogfights. In the highly swept 72-degree angle, it could reach a maximum speed of 1,553 miles per hour, 250 miles per hour faster than the MiG-21. Entering service in the early 70s, with its infrared homing air-to-air missiles and its powerful high lark look-down radar, probably developed from American units captured during Vietnam, it became the mainstay of the Warsaw Pact air forces throughout that decade, being produced at a rate of 500 per year. It saw action in the Iraq-Iran War, and again in 1982 during the conflict between Syria and Israel, where the faster and more heavily armed MiG-23s suffered heavy losses against the much more agile Israeli Kiefers and F-16s. Its prototype was first shown at the Domodedovo Air Show in 1967. It contrasted with a Delta Wing prototype featuring limited vertical and short takeoff and landing, or V-STOL capability, which was used in the later Yakovlev Forger. It was basically a MiG-21 with 2 vertically mounted lift jets installed in tandem in the center fuselage section. As well as its variable geometry wings, the MiG-23 prototype utilized side-mounted air intakes, leaving more room for internal fuel tanks and better avionics, not least of which could now be mounted in the nose cone. For the first time, it featured a head-up display or HUD system and a laser rangefinder. The MiG-27 was a dedicated air-to-ground derivative of the 23. Entering service in the mid-70s, it was cheaper to produce and was designed specifically for a ground attack role. However, with its bigger engines, it could carry greater warloads. As well as the larger engine, it had additional cockpit armor and a distinctive claw at the winglet. It also featured a head-up display, look-down radar, laser range finding, and self-guided missiles. Utilizing TV imaging equipment, it could attack small, durable ground targets. The MiG-23 and 27 were used successfully in Afghanistan until they came up against the US Stinger shoulder-launched anti-aircraft missile. As well as developing these radical designs, the Bureau, now headed by Belyakov, vowed to push more conventional delta-wing aircraft to their limits. The prototype utilized the successful side-mounted air intakes, but pioneered the use of twin vertical tails to improve directional stability at high angles of attack. On the 5th of October 1967, Mikhail Komarov reached a speed of 1,853 miles per hour, while Alexander Fedotov zoomed to an incredible 123,525 feet. The resulting MiG-25 Foxbat was a long-range, high-altitude Mach 2.8 interceptor, designed to meet the threat of nuclear bombers, particularly the B-58 and XB-70 Valkyrie Mach 3 high-altitude strategic bomber, which the US Air Force was developing but later cancelled. The Foxbat's appearance in the 1970s prompted near hysteria in the West, as its capabilities were greatly speculated and exaggerated upon, probably pushing forward development of the US Air Force's F-15 Eagle. It had valve technology radar, which lacked the sophistication of Western equipment, but offered very high power, and thus the ability to burn through the defenses provided by the enemy's electronic countermeasures. It also benefited from highly organized ground stations that could relay information and commands directly to the cockpit, as well as receiving and analyzing information in return from the aircraft and its missiles. The MiG-25R reconnaissance variant could photograph the whole of Great Britain in one mission. One infamous MiG-25 pilot was Lieutenant Viktor Belenko of PVO Strany, the Soviet Air Defense Command, who on the 6th of September 1976 landed his MiG-25 at Hakodate Civil Airport in northern Japan. The intelligence gained from his defection helped to allay many of the fears and dispel many of the myths that surrounded this formidable aircraft. However, it is still considered the fastest combat aircraft in the world. Later variants have reportedly been tracked on radar over the Sinai Peninsula in Israel at Mach 3.2. MiG-25 record holders include Boris Arlov, who gained the record for the fastest rate of climb, Pyotr Ostapenko, who holds 6 world records, and Svetlana Savitskaya, a female cosmonaut who holds 4 speed and altitude records. The technology needed to push an aircraft this far demanded a new level of Soviet industrial competence. At 3 times the speed of sound, temperatures on an aircraft's fuselage could vary by almost 300 degrees Celsius. This called for new metal alloys to be developed to ever higher tolerances. Measuring, testing, and quality control had to be greatly improved over previous practices. These technologies were used to improve upon the basic MiG-25 design to produce the MiG-31 Foxhound, a ground attack and low-level interceptor derivative of the 25 as the MiG-27 was to the 23. It was ordered as a direct response to the American B-1 bomber, which seemed perfectly capable of overflying the entire Soviet Union with impunity by simply descending below the coverage of ground radar. This made it invisible to traditional short-range interceptors that had relied upon radar information from ground stations to find their targets. Likewise, it was found that F-15s, Tornadoes, and even cruise missiles could quite conceivably attack targets within Russia at low level without being detected. The driving force behind the design of this new aircraft was the need for new technology that could combat this new threat. The basic shape of the MiG-25 was retained because of its superb supersonic capabilities. However, the maximum speed requirement was dropped to Mach 2.4 so that more efficient Tumansky low-silhouette turbojet engines could be used, each with a thrust of 34,171 pounds. The size of its armaments, provision for better avionics, and a 2-man crew drove the size of this aircraft to about that of an F-111. Its on-board data processing and radar technology The weapon control system consisted of a brand new type of radar, which overcame the drawbacks of traditional systems. Typically, an impulse radar beam would cover about 2 degrees of arc and would be scanned relatively slowly across the sky by a mechanical movement of the radar dish. Using a very stable static radar aerial and mirrors to shift the beam almost instantaneously around the sky, the new system, called Phase Aerial Net, can track multiple targets in different parts of the sky at the same time. Traditional radar on the F-14 could cover an area of 145 square degrees in the process of mechanical scanning. The MiG-31's phase aerial net can scan 20,000 square degrees, most important of which would be the area below the aircraft where low-flying cruise missiles, bombers or ground attack aircraft would be operating. The cockpit featured an enhanced head-up display system. The weapons control system features an indicator panel displaying missile deployment and readiness. The observer navigator has call-upon tactical situation indicators, control panels for the preparation of weapons, and an extensive set of navigational aids. The phase aerial net system enables targets to be spotted at a distance of 110 miles. At a range of 90 miles, the system can capture, identify, and automatically track up to 10 targets. The 4 most dangerous can be attacked simultaneously with 4 missiles, which are all controlled and guided to their respective targets by the radar system. New air-to-air missiles provide hitting power against high or low altitude targets beyond visual range at speeds of up to 2,300 miles per hour. Communications from ground to air and back, and between separate aircraft, were such that an airborne early warning and defense system against low-flying targets had been successfully created. By the mid-70s, the Mikoyan Bureau was to put all of this new knowledge and technology to the task of giving the Soviet Union a new aircraft that would finally close the gap between East and West. Until now, most MiG designs and much of the Soviet Air Force's strategy had been defensive. The entire third generation of MiG jets, the MiG-21, the 23-27 swing-wing designs, and the 25-31 twin-tail aircraft, had primarily been designed as interceptors, conceived as a defense to the threat of nuclear bombers. The second generation, MiG-15, 17 and 19, had performed well in dogfights over Korea and Vietnam, but were now outdated in terms of aerodynamics, power and avionics. There was a definite need for a new fourth generation multi-role fighter to compete with the American F-15 Eagle and F-16 Flying Falcon. An aircraft that would primarily perform well in air combat, but with a secondary ground attack role. Handling was to be improved. Acceleration was to be improved 1.5 times. Payload capability was to be improved twofold. And performance at increased angles of attack was to be greatly enhanced. It had to be flexible enough to be deployed from an aircraft carrier and incorporate the latest avionics. Previously, an increase of 10% in flying and fighting capability was considered a great success. This latest advance would require a quantum leap in development, with designers and engineers facing completely new demands in hitherto uncharted areas of development. R.A. Belyakov, who had taken over as chief designer after the retirement of Mikhail Gorievich and the death of Artem Mikoyan in 1970, had stamped his personal mark on the design of the MiG-23 and 25, but knew all too well the pressure that his team was under to continue to perform.
Для того, чтобы создать современный авиационный комплекс на высоком научно-техническом уровне, на уровне лучших...
To create a flying complex that was better than anything else in the world, all its parts and equipment should also come up to world standards. To do this, we should research foreign technology and engineering. We should compete with not only the world's best aircraft, but with the best aircraft of the future. Each new design is a complex effort between workers, designers and engineers, design bureaus, factories, laboratories and test facilities. For the chief designer, his deputy and leading engineers, seeing a design go from paper to manufacture is a very long-term project, during which time they are wholly responsible for it. That is why it is very important for people to be able to work well together. Over the years of working on the aircraft, we have developed excellent staff. We say that there are two big achievements: technology and the people who have developed in the process. Workers, designers, test pilots are all important, and the success of a project depends on them. So, before creating a new aircraft, the staff do all sorts of research, laboratory work, modeling. What makes our bureau special is that we handle everything at all levels within the design period. We are responsible for creating not only fighter bombers, but interceptors and reconnaissance aircraft as well. We have not only a technical responsibility, but a party responsibility and a moral responsibility, because we are aware that if we cannot achieve our goals or cannot do better than our foreign competitors, no one else can or is capable of doing so in this country.
The result of all this effort, the prototype that was to become the MiG-29 Fulcrum, obviously met with great approval as Valery Manitsky displayed its flying capabilities to Leonid Brezhnev as early as October 1977. The design owed much to the high-speed MiG-25 Foxbat, with its twin engines and twin tails. But to achieve new goals, radical solutions had been found. Traditionally, components of the aircraft had always been treated separately. The fuselage housed the cockpit, engines, and avionics. The wings provided aerodynamic lift, and the tail provided horizontal and vertical stability. In order to achieve maximum lift and maneuverability, the team moved towards a fully integrated design, where all the components contributed to aerodynamic lift. It allowed the development of a minimal frontal drag profile, whilst maximizing the volume in which to locate its major equipment. The body at the front of the aircraft took on the shape of a thick wing profile, with the Lex wing root extensions beneath the cockpit greatly improving stability and maneuverability. At high angles of attack, the Lex shed vortexes over the top of the wing, thus maintaining airflow and reducing wingtip stall. Design and construction took into account the latest Western technology, with many parts being made of composite materials, where the major component was carbon fiber. Joints were made from highest purity aluminium, steel, and titanium, with many internal structures comprising honeycomb sections for maximum strength with minimum weight. The canopy was designed for minimum drag, whilst affording the widest possible visibility. No one engine could meet the desired brief, so a brand new turbofan engine was designed. Two of these Tumansky RD-33 engines, each developing 35,000 pounds of thrust, were incorporated into the MiG-29's design, giving it a maximum speed of Mach 2.3 and a maximum takeoff weight of 40,000 pounds, enabling it to carry virtually all of the Soviets' current armaments at any speed, any altitude, and at any angle. With external drop tanks, the operational range exceeded 1,300 miles. Early testing by Takhtar Abubakirov at high angles of attack proved that the right decisions had been made, and to some extent the actual flight characteristics proved better than theoretical design figures had predicted. Improvement was an ongoing concern, and throughout the 80s, development continued. By the late 80s, testing was well underway for a Navy version that could fly from the new Tbilisi-class aircraft carriers. Alexei Fedotov, a MiG test pilot for many years, praised the flying characteristics of this new generation jet. As a new generation of test pilots, such as Gavrilovich Fastovets and Takhtar Abubakirov, continued his work. These airfield-based ram tests were soon to be followed by carrier-based testing. Contrary to the West's expectations, the cockpit featured a very conventional control system, which, although lacking the sophistication of a fly-by-wire computerized system, did have the advantage of being very familiar to the vast majority of the existing MiG pilots.
This aircraft is beyond comparison with any other. It is very easy to fly. Personally, I was retrained to fly it without very much preliminary training at all, and without flying in anything very similar. I have experienced no difficulties at all, and it is especially easy to land. I didn't experience the difficulties of conversion, which typified the previous types of fighters, such as the MiG-21 and MiG-23. It fully meets its flight objectives.
The weapon system consists of 3 target-seeking channels: a radar station that can detect targets at a distance of 60 miles, an infrared detector and laser range finder that works at medium range, and a sighting device in the pilot's helmet that works for targets within visual range. All these systems interact through a sophisticated computer system which controls all of the armaments. The radar sighting system, developed from that in the MiG-31, is used to pinpoint and track up to 10 targets against terrestrial and sky backgrounds. It can also track targets flying along converging and parallel courses, as well as picking up specific targets maneuvering through Doppler frequencies alongside routes. Such a tracking pattern is necessary to effect a sudden surprise attack. It can engage enemy aircraft at a distance of 30 to 40 miles, knocking them down with the AA-10 beyond visual range radar-guided air-to-air missile. The Coles Quantum Optical Radar Unit enables detection of targets through an infrared heat-seeking channel and a laser rangefinder. Once the target has been pinpointed by the heat seeker, the laser rangefinder comes into operation. The heat seeker can detect targets flying in the rear hemisphere behind the aircraft at a distance of up to 10 miles. The laser can then measure the range to an accuracy of between 1,000 and 13,000 feet. The whole system can lock onto a visible target in 2 seconds. This system overcomes the problems of electronic radio interference that can hamper traditional radar systems. The call system also increases the accuracy of the MiG's 30mm cannon, located in the left-hand wing root extension. The call system relays the complex information on angular coordinates, target range, and angular velocity taken from a highly maneuvering opponent in a dogfight to the weapons system computer, which uses computational algorithms to predict where a target will be at any time. It can also accurately predict maneuvering intensity and specific G-loads, and generally requires a maximum of only 5 to 7 rounds of ammunition to destroy a target. Finally, the helmet-mounted target acquisition system relays all essential data to short-range missile, COLS, and radar systems. The pilot merely has to turn his head and catch the target in the helmet sights, and the appropriate system will lock onto the enemy aircraft. The armament consists of a maximum of 6 air-to-air guided missiles and the 30mm cannon with 150 rounds firing at a rate of 1,800 rounds per minute. It can also carry bombs slung onto its external stores, as well as standard 57.8 or 240mm rocket projectiles. The Mikoyan design team could breathe a sigh of relief as the result of 10 years' work was applauded by critics throughout the world, not least of which was the Soviet military hierarchy.
Самолет МиГ-29 имеет очень мощное вооружение.
The MiG-29 has a very powerful weapons system and very good flight characteristics, and also, very importantly, it is very easy to fly. It is our opinion that there is no other aircraft existing in the world that can match it. If we compare foreign-made aircraft in the same class, they show up very poorly or less well when compared to the MiG-29. I have to say that it is the pride of our industry and that our chief designers worked very hard and produced an excellent plane.
Undoubtedly, the MiG-29 represents a quantum leap for Soviet aviation and proves without a doubt that Soviet military technology, philosophy, and ingenuity equals that of the West. However, in an ever-changing world, the massive upheavals in the Soviet Union mean that the Mikoyan Bureau now has to face a much sterner critic, that of the open market. With the breakup of the old Soviet Union, the design bureaus are struggling to find their way in a new market economy and a new world order. Without the massive state assistance that they once had, and without many of their traditional buyers, as many Eastern Bloc countries move away from Soviet dominance. If the bureaus survive, the MiG-29 could herald the dawning of a new era in aircraft technology, with a whole new generation of Russian combat aircraft building on the decades of innovative design, but also benefiting from Western technological advances in the free exchange of ideas that has developed since Glasnost. Or, if they don't survive, then the MiG-29 could stand as a memorial to the greatest and most influential Russian design bureau, the last great Soviet combat aircraft, the last MiG.
The aircraft had completed their maneuvers, it seemed, and that they were joining up, perhaps to circuit and then land. And as one aircraft joined the other, they touched, and the lower of the two aircraft appeared to break up almost immediately. The second aircraft climbed up sharply to the left, and there seemed to be a measure of control, but then it too began to break up, and fire broke out. By that time, the first aircraft had gone down. There was a pall of black smoke. We saw two parachutes. We believe that they were both single-seaters, and therefore both pilots had banged out. I don't think the Russians would ever send pilots anywhere around the world who couldn't be relied upon to do a professional job, and that's just what they were doing.